The badge hit the counter with a flat plastic sound, not thrown, not slammed, simply placed the way you set down something that has stopped belonging to you. Tessa Calloway stood in the hallway of Fort Detrick Army Medical Center on a gray Tuesday morning in November, holding a cardboard box that contained 9 years of her life, a stethoscope, a worn copy of a field medicine manual with her own annotations running down the margins in pencil, a photograph of two people standing in a Montana field at dusk, the light going gold behind them, a small river stone flat and smooth that her father had pressed into her palm the summer before everything changed, telling her to keep it because it reminded him of patience. The security officer beside her, young, clearly uncomfortable, avoiding her eyes, shifted his weight from one foot to the other. She did not make it easier for him. She had been told to clear her workspace and exit the building within 30 minutes. She had done it in 11. The hallway stretched ahead of her toward the main exit, past the nurse's station, past the ICU bay, past the room where she had spent more hours than she could count, keeping people alive by the slimmest possible margins. Orderlies moved past without looking. A physician she recognized glanced up from a chart, then glanced away. The fluorescent lights hummed their permanent, indifferent hum. The building did not register that she was leaving. She was 10 steps from the exit when the monitor alarm went off. Not the routine kind, not the low-frequency alert that meant a reading needed attention. This was the sharp, sustained tone that every person who had ever worked in a medical facility learned to feel in the back of their teeth. Code blue. ICU Bay 2. Tessa stopped walking. The security officer stopped beside her. Through the glass panel of Bay 2, she could see a nurse already moving, a second reaching for the crash cart, a third frozen for 1 second too long, that single second that separated a patient who walked out of a hospital from one who did not. Tessa set the cardboard box on the floor. The security officer said her name. She was already moving. Nobody stopped her. That said something. She was not certain what exactly. Perhaps that in a genuine emergency termination orders and access badges, in the bureaucratic machinery of institutional displacement, became very small things very quickly. Perhaps that somewhere in the muscle memory of that building, people still understood what her hands were capable of. Or perhaps they were simply too focused on the crisis to remember that 20 minutes ago, a colonel had signed her out of existence. She pushed through the door of Bay 2 and assessed the room in the way she assessed every room she entered, completely immediately, without announcing herself. The patient was a 63-year-old retired postal worker named Gerald Fitch, post-operative from a hip replacement, and his heart had decided it was done cooperating. The attending physician was still 60 seconds away. The nurses were good. They were doing what they had been trained to do, but there was a hesitation in the room, a collective uncertainty about sequencing, and Tessa had spent 9 years learning that hesitation killed faster than almost anything else in the inventory of things that killed people. She moved to the correct position, and her hands did what her hands always did, and the room reorganized itself around her, the way rooms had always reorganized themselves around her when the situation required it. 41 seconds after she entered, Gerald Fitch had a pulse. She stepped back. The attending arrived, took in the scene, looked at Tessa, looked at the security officer in the doorway, looked at the monitor, confirming a stable rhythm, and said nothing at all. Tessa picked up her box from the hallway floor and walked out of the building into the cold November air. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her that required it. 14 hours earlier, Tessa Calloway had arrived for her overnight shift, the way she arrived for every shift, early, quiet, and alone. Fort Detrick occupied the gentle hills of western Maryland, its buildings a mix of old brick and modern concrete. They gave the whole installation the feeling of a place that had grown without a plan, adding structures as need arose, never quite deciding what it wanted to be when it grew up. The medical center stood on the eastern edge of the post, a 6-story building that carried the particular smell of antiseptic and recycled air, and the exhausted hope that accumulated in places where people spent their worst days. Tessa had walked those hallways for 14 months, long enough to know which elevator ran slow, long enough to know which vending machine on the 3rd floor still took dollar bills, long enough to have saved 47 lives by the count she kept in a small notebook she showed to no one, because that count was not for recognition. It was the same discipline her father had taught her about maintaining a rifle. Consistent. Because precision mattered, and because someday the accuracy of the record might matter in ways she could not predict. She was 27 years old and stood 5 feet 4 inches tall. In the oversized army scrubs she wore on overnight shifts, she looked like a graduate student who had borrowed her older siblings' clothes. The appearance was not entirely accidental. She had spent her entire adult life learning how to be underestimated because she had learned early that people who underestimated you handed you an advantage they did not know they were offering. Her father had taught her that too. She stowed her bag, checked the duty board, and took her first walk through the ward before looking at the handoff notes. This was her habit. She wanted to see the patients before she read about them because notes were written by tired people at the end of long shifts who sometimes missed the things that resisted language. The way a patient held their arms slightly away from their body, the barely perceptible asymmetry in someone's breathing pattern, the particular quality of stillness in a person whose pain medication was either insufficient or excessive. She moved through the ward in the dim pre-shift light, quiet enough that most patients did not stir cataloging without appearing to catalog, her eyes moving with a steady professional economy that a trauma surgeon might have recognized and a civilian would not have noticed at all. The ward was calm. She returned to the nurse's station and opened the handoff notes. That was when she first looked at the entry for Base 7. The night passed the way most nights passed in a functional military medical unit with the steady procedural rhythm of a place managing known problems with practiced solutions. IV lines checked, vitals logged, the quiet dialogue between monitors and clipboards that added up hour by hour to keeping human beings breathing and stable. Tessa worked through it the way she worked through everything, thoroughly, without drawing attention to herself. 2 hours into the shift, FCLI Sutton from the security detail assigned to Base 7 came to the nurse's station asking for ibuprofen. Sutton was 22 and looked younger. He had the broad, earnest face of someone who belonged on a high school football team, and he was sweating in a temperature-controlled hallway in November, which was the first thing Tessa noticed. The second thing was the specific disorientation in his eyes. Not the vague look of insufficient sleep, but the confusion of a brain not receiving adequate blood flow. She told him to sit down. He said he was fine, he just needed ibuprofen. She told him to sit down again in the tone she used when she was not asking. He sat. His skin was hot and dry, his pulse elevated, his color wrong for November in Maryland. She asked when he had last had water, and he thought about it longer than a person should have to think about it. Heat exhaustion, moderate presentation. Not life-threatening with prompt intervention, but heading somewhere worse if left untreated. She treated him at the nurse's station over the next 8 minutes, oral rehydration, positioning monitoring. She explained what was happening in plain language and watched his color begin to improve and the confusion clear from his eyes, and he looked at her with the genuine surprise of someone who had not expected a problem or its solution to be so direct. Master Sergeant Vince Greer appeared at the end of the hallway while this was happening. He was 49, built like a man who had spent 3 decades doing things hard on the body and had simply decided to be harder in return. Gray at the temples, the particular bearing of someone who had commanded men under fire and retained the habit of reading every room for threat, even when rooms contained no threats. He had arrived that morning as the senior NCO on the protective detail for Base 7's patient, and he had formed clear professional assessments of the medical staff he was sharing space with. He watched Tessa work without interrupting. When Sutton's condition had stabilized, Greer walked to the nurse's station and stood there for a moment. He did not say good work or thank you. He looked at her for a 3 count, then at Sutton, then offered a single nod, small, precise, the vocabulary of men who expressed approval sparingly because the currency was worth more when it was rare. Then he returned down the hall. From the far end of the corridor, SFC, Colt Stannard watched this exchange with his arms crossed and his expression indicating he had revised nothing. Stannard communicated skepticism the way other men communicated language, constantly, fluently, with the precision of long practice. In the first 2 hours of the shift, he had made 3 remarks about the overnight medical staffing, each falling just inside the boundary of professional commentary and just outside the boundary of anything else. He was not malicious. He was in the specific way of men who had been in dangerous places and developed very strong opinions about competence, simply direct about his standards. The remarks had included a question about whether the overnight staff had any field trauma experience, an observation about the relative capabilities of medics who had deployed versus those who had not, and a comment that the person currently responsible for the most critical patient on the floor looked like she was probably still paying off student loans. Tessa had heard all 3. She had not responded to any of them. Chief Petty Officer Dale Wexler, standing quietly near the window at the end of the hall for most of the evening, had heard all 3 as well. Wexler was 51, compact and deliberate, with a face that had stopped being readable sometime in his late 30s and settled into a permanent expression of watchful neutrality. 17 years in SEAL support units, followed by a career in medical logistics, had given him a particular skill the ability to look at a person and understand what they were before they had finished introducing themselves. He had been watching Tessa since she arrived, watching the way her hands moved, the way her eyes moved, the specific quality of stillness she maintained in a room, not the stillness of passivity, but the stillness of someone who had learned to hold in reserve to not expend what might later be needed. He said nothing to anyone about what he thought he was seeing. He was not yet certain enough to say it out loud. Base 7's patient had arrived at 2:17 in the morning the previous night, brought by civilian ambulance rather than military transport. The paperwork identified him as a John Doe, approximately 44 years old, involved in a single vehicle accident on Interstate 270. Blunt force head trauma, 3 fractured ribs on the right side, partial splenic laceration managed non-operatively, unconscious on arrival and remained so through the night and into the following day. The paperwork was complete, every box filled, every signature in its correct place. Tessa had learned in 14 months that complete paperwork was not always the same thing as accurate paperwork. She read the intake documentation 3 times because something about it created a specific quiet discomfort she had long since learned to take seriously. Not any single line. The aggregate of it, the evenness, the way it answered every question preemptively, as if assembled by someone who understood what questions would be asked and prepared answers in advance. She set the discomfort aside and did her job. The patient's vitals were stable. His neurological checks were consistent with the documented head trauma. The splenic laceration was being managed appropriately. Nothing in his clinical presentation required immediate intervention. But she looked at his hands. They were the hands of a man who had spent years gripping things, weapons, ropes, equipment requiring sustained force. The calluses were placed with the precision of repetition. His forearms had a muscular development she recognized not from anatomy textbooks, but from the men who had come through her father's life during her childhood, briefly, intensely, and without much explanation. At the base of his neck, just below the hospital gown collar, on the left side a small tattoo. Not decorative, a blood type in military notation and a 4-digit year. The kind that special operations personnel sometimes place somewhere accessible and permanent in case the person who eventually found them needed to know exactly one thing quickly. She noted it. She noted it the way she noted everything without changing her expression, without pausing, without giving any indication that she had seen anything beyond standard clinical information. Then she finished her assessment and moved to the next patient. The problem with the pharmaceutical inventory had started 3 weeks earlier on a quiet Tuesday night when Tessa had finished her clinical documentation 40 minutes before the end of her shift, and in the idle habit of a thorough mind decided to cross-reference the dispensing logs against the controlled substance inventory. It was not her job. Her job was patient care. But her father had told her once that ignorance was not a neutral state. Ignorance was a choice, and it was the most expensive choice most people never realized they were making. She found the first discrepancy almost immediately. Cefiderocol, a high-generation antibiotic used in multi-drug-resistant infections, expensive and tightly controlled, had been logged as expired and destroyed over 3 months in quantities inconsistent with the facility's patient volume for conditions requiring that treatment. The destruction documentation carried the correct signatures and dates. But one of the co-signing physicians had transferred to Wiesbaden, Germany, 7 weeks before the most recent batch was documented as destroyed. His signature appeared on destruction logs dated after his transfer. She sat with that for a moment. Then she started looking at other categories. Over the following 2 weeks, in the quiet hours of overnight shifts and in her own time at home, she found a pattern. Not a dramatic pattern, nothing as obvious as falsified records in any single ledger. A pattern of small, consistent discrepancies across multiple categories. Morphine sulfate, fentanyl patches, advanced wound care kits, combat gauze, hemostatic dressings, standard and combat trauma packages, portable equipment appearing in intake logs and disappearing from physical inventory, with documentation that examined line by line was technically adequate and examined as a whole was quietly wrong in a dozen small ways that only accumulated if you were looking. The common thread in every discrepancy was a contractor called Meridian Solutions. She searched the name, found a Delaware registration, a sparse web presence, and a contract history with military medical facilities across 6 states, found a corporate structure consistent with something built to move things through it rather than to actually do anything in particular. She had been careful, methodical. She organized her findings into 3 pages of dense, precise notes and placed the supporting documentation in an envelope addressed to the Inspector General's office. She intended to submit it at the beginning of her next shift through the official channel because that was the process and she believed in process, and she had no reason yet to think the process would be used against her. She went home and slept. When she came in the next morning, Colonel Douglas Merritt was waiting. His office occupied the corner of the fourth floor with the best light and the best view. He had furnished it with the careful attention of a man who understood that an office communicated something, every photograph, every commendation, arranged to convey specific things to the people sitting across his desk. He was 56, lean in the way of men who exercise for performance, rather than appearance, with silver hair at regulation length and the practiced warmth of someone who had spent decades managing upward. His uniform was immaculate. His decorations were extensive. He had the kind of face that photographed well in official settings and revealed very little in private ones. He did not stand when she entered. He slid a folder across the desk and let her read it. Unauthorized access to controlled substance inventory records outside her designated care area. Access to procurement and logistics documentation beyond the scope of her assigned duties. A pattern of conduct inconsistent with her position and responsibilities. Every allegation supported by timestamps, access logs, specific dates, and times. All of it assembled overnight. She read it to the end and understood this had been prepared before she moved to file her report. Someone had been watching her watch them, and they had been prepared, and what she had believed was a trustworthy process was a corridor with someone already waiting at the other end. She looked up. Merritt watched her with the expression of a man reviewing the outcome of a calculation he had already completed. She placed the envelope she had prepared on his desk. I prepared a report for the Inspector General's office. He said that report will be reviewed as part of the broader administrative process associated with your separation. She understood what that meant. Completely. She stood and walked out of his office and packed her box in 11 minutes and handed in her badge and started walking toward the exit. She had taken 10 steps when the code blue alarm went off. After Gerald Fitch had a pulse and she had set her box down and picked it back up and walked out into the November air, she stood on the concrete steps and thought with the uncluttered attention of someone who had just watched a plan fail and was already building the next one. She knew the documentation she had assembled was accurate. She knew the pattern was real. She knew that Merritt had moved to terminate her within hours of detecting her interest in the procurement records, which meant that whatever lay beneath the surface of those records was worth protecting aggressively. She knew she had no badge, no official standing, and no clear avenue for getting what she knew to anyone positioned to act on it. She was thinking through this when a man appeared at her left shoulder. She had not heard him approach. In itself, that was information. She had been conditioned since childhood to register approaching footfalls, and the people she missed were the people who did not want to be heard, which meant this was someone with specific training. He was in his 30s, medium height, dressed in civilian clothes that fit slightly too well on the shoulders. His face arranged in the deliberate blankness of someone who did not want to be remembered. He said quietly, "You weren't fired for making a mistake." He pressed a small USB drive into her hand, the kind available at any office supply store, the plastic casing slightly worn at one corner from frequent handling. "You were fired for being right," he said. He walked away across the parking lot without looking back. Tessa stood on the steps and looked at the drive in her palm. She closed her fingers around it and looked back at the building, at the glass doors and the fluorescent light visible through them, and the ordinary institutional exterior of a place where something was deeply wrong. Then she walked to her truck. She did not know yet what was on the drive. She did not know the name of the man who had given it to her. She did not know that inside that building in Base 7, a man she had monitored all night was carrying the only complete record of everything she had suspected, and considerably more than she had suspected. She did not know that in approximately 12 hours, a black SUV with federal plates would arrive at the postgate and a man with 4 stars on his collar would step out of it, and the building she had just left would become something very different from what it had been that morning. She knew only that her hands wrapped around the steering wheel of her 10-year-old truck in the Fort Detrick parking lot were steady. They had always been steady. Owen Calloway had made sure of that. He had been a gunnery sergeant in Marine Recon, a quiet, deliberate man from western Montana who had joined the Corps at 18 and discovered he was very good at the particular combination of patience and precision that certain work required. He deployed 4 times. He came home 4 times. He came home different each time, in the ways men came home different from those places. But he came home, and he came home to a house outside Missoula with a daughter who had her mother's eyes in his hand. He started teaching Tessa to shoot on a Saturday morning in early spring when she was 8 years old on the long flat stretch behind the barn that the Montana wind crossed without obstacle. He set up a simple target and showed her how to hold the rifle and how to breathe and how to be still in the particular way that stillness was required. He said, shooting isn't about the gun. The gun is a tool. Shooting is about understanding what your body is doing and making it do exactly what you tell it. He said, between heartbeats, there's a moment of complete stillness. That's where everything happens. She had been a precise student. Precision was she understood even at 8, a form of respect for the thing you were doing and for the people affected by whether you did it well or badly. Over 5 years, she had learned everything her father could teach her. The physics of ballistics, not from textbooks, but from the lived experience of watching where shots landed and understanding why. Wind reading, elevation adjustment, the particular discipline of waiting, not passive waiting, but active stillness that required complete engagement rather than absence. She had been good. Her father told her so, and Owen Calloway did not offer assessments he did not mean. Then April 2010, she had been 13. The call came on a Thursday morning and her mother answered it, and Tessa knew from the sound of her mother's voice, before she could hear the words, what the words were going to be. Marine Recon, Kunar Province, Afghanistan. Killed in action. At the funeral in the flat, devastating calm of someone who had run out of everything except honesty, her mother held her hand and said, he died for those things. I don't want you near them. Promise me. Tessa had promised. She had meant it. She had carried that promise through enlistment, through training, through 14 months at Fort Detrick, and 47 saved lives in one Riverstone on a desk that was no longer her desk. She had carried it all the way to a parking lot in Maryland with a USB drive in her pocket, and her father's voice somewhere in the back of everything saying what it had always said when the conditions were difficult and the shot had to be made anyway. Steady, between the heartbeats, she put the truck in gear. Whatever was coming next, her hands were ready for it. She drove to the end of the post road and parked where the pavement gave way to gravel, and she sat with the engine off and the heater ticking as it cooled in the USB drive on the passenger seat. The morning had the flat gray, warmthless quality of November light in Maryland. The trees along the fence line had shed most of their leaves. The ground was the color of things that had been waiting a long time for something to change. She had been there 11 minutes when her phone rang. Unknown number, area code 301. She let it ring twice, then answered. The voice was male, older, unhurried, in the way of someone who had long since stopped being impressed by urgency. He said, Staff Sergeant Calloway. Not a question, a confirmation. She said, speaking. Don't go home. Don't access the drive on any network device. Come back to the main entrance and ask for Master Sergeant Greer. He'll be expecting you. The line ended. She sat with the phone in her hand. The heater ticked. The gray light moved across the dashboard. Then she put the truck in gear and drove back. At the main entrance, the same security officer who had walked her out 40 minutes ago stood at the desk with an expression mixing confusion and something that might have been relief. Before she could speak, Master Sergeant Greer appeared at the far end of the lobby, moving with the deliberate economy of a man who did not walk toward things so much as arrive at them. He said, come with me. They took the stairs rather than the elevator, Greer's choice, which she filed as information, and moved down the east corridor toward a conference room Tessa had never had reason to use. Greer opened the door and held it. She stepped through and understood immediately why she had been called back. The man standing at the window was 64 years old and wore his uniform the way certain men wore their faces, as something earned rather than issued. 4 stars on each shoulder. The posture of someone who had stopped thinking about posture decades ago because it had become the shape of him. Hair white at the temples and silver through the crown. The face of a man who had spent a significant portion of his life outdoors in conditions not meant to be comfortable. Admiral Gerald Harwick turned from the window. He looked at her with the direct measuring attention of a man who had been briefed and was now determining how well the briefing matched the reality. She stood straight and waited. He said, "You're Owen Calloway's daughter." Not a question. She said, "Yes, sir." Something moved across his face, not sentiment exactly, something older and more contained. He nodded once and gestured to the chair across the table. "Sit down, we have a problem and I need to understand what you know about it." She sat. He remained standing, which told her something about how he was processing the situation. He said, "The man in Base 7. She said, "I know he's not John Doe." Harwick looked at her steadily. "What else?" His hands, the tattoo on his neck, blood type and military notation. The physical development is specific to long-term operational work, not general fitness. The intake documentation is complete enough to pass a standard review, but has the quality of something assembled quickly by someone who knows what the checklist requires. Harwick was quiet for a moment. His name is Cal Novak, he said. He works for me, has for 8 years. His last assignment was collecting evidence against a procurement fraud network operating inside military medical supply chains across the eastern seaboard. A pause. He was delivering that evidence when a vehicle struck his car from behind on I-270 at 11 o'clock Sunday night. Tessa kept her eyes on him. The accident was arranged. Novak had the presence of mind in the period between the impact and losing consciousness to secure what he was carrying. Harwick looked at her hands, then back at her face. Someone in this building has been trying to locate what he was carrying since the ambulance arrived. That person does not yet know whether it left the building. Tessa reached into her pocket and placed the USB drive on the table. Harwick looked at it without reaching for it. Did you access it? No, sir. I was told not to use a network device, and I don't own anything that isn't networked. The faintest adjustment crossed his expression. He picked up the drive and placed it in his interior jacket pocket. Your termination is suspended pending a review I've personally requested. As of now, you are attached to my protective detail in your capacity as a combat medic. He moved toward the door. Master Sergeant Greer will brief you on movement specifics. We're transporting Novak to a secure facility in 2 hours. He stopped at the door. One more thing. The drive Novak was carrying contains access credentials and directory structure. The complete data, 6 years of transaction, records, supplier documentation, chain of custody for every shipment. Meridian Solutions processed is stored on a physical server in a private logistics facility in Frederick, Maryland. Merritt's people have the address. Based on Novak's assessment of their response protocols, we have approximately 3 hours before they send someone to wipe it. She said, and after Frederick, Harwick said, one problem at a time. He left. In the hallway outside, Wexler fell into step beside her for exactly 4 paces, long enough to say quietly and without looking at her, the Barrett's in the transport vehicle, second case on the left. She did not ask how he knew she might need that information. Some things announced themselves without requiring explanation. They moved Novak at 1400 hours through a loading bay on the north side of the building. Greer ran the transport the way he ran everything efficiently, with flat specific language assigning positions and responsibilities in terms that left no room for interpretation. Tessa was in the second vehicle with Sutton and Wexler. She checked Novak's IV line twice before they loaded him, because checking twice was not doubt, it was discipline. They were 12 minutes from the destination when the lead vehicle stopped. No radio call, no signal. It simply stopped in the middle of a 2-lane road running between an open field and a line of commercial buildings, and the absence of communication was itself the emergency. Wexler said contact. The shot came from the right, from the roof of a storage facility overlooking the road. A single report, distant but clear in the cold air. The front left tire of the lead vehicle collapsed, and the vehicle drifted hard to the shoulder. Greer's voice on the radio, controlled and immediate. Sniper on the roof northeast. Distance 740 approximately. Nobody moves to the roadside. Stannard and 2 others from the lead vehicle were already behind it, using the body for cover. Greer was on the radio calling their position. The sniper had a clear angle on anyone who attempted to move from either vehicle to the drainage ditch on the left, the only available ground cover. They were effectively pinned. Tessa was already calculating. Wind from the northwest approximately 9 miles per hour based on the movement of dry grass in the field to the left. Temperature 41 degrees. At 740 meters, with a .50 BMG round bullet drop in the range of 260 inches, adjusted for current atmospheric conditions. Then Sutton made a sound that overrode every calculation. She turned. He had been hit not by the sniper's round, but by the vehicle's abrupt stop, the doorframe catching his right leg at an angle that had opened something it should not have opened. He was pale in the specific way that meant the color was leaving him all at once. And through the tear in his uniform pants, she could see that the femoral artery had been compromised. 90 seconds, maybe less. She was across the vehicle in a movement that was not fast, because fast was not what was needed. Precise was what was needed, and precision was what she had. Both hands on his thigh, direct pressure. She said his name once clearly to keep him with her, and confirmed what the volume of blood had already told her. She reached for the tourniquet with her right hand. The combat application tourniquet, standard issue, positioned above the wound. Her left hand maintained pressure while her right positioned the cat and began tightening. She had done this procedure hundreds of times. Her hands knew the sequence before her mind could form the intention. She heard Greer's voice over the radio. We need that shooter down. Nobody has the angle. She heard Wexler from outside the vehicle. Barrett's in the back. Distance is past anything I've got. Standards pinned. Greer doesn't have elevation, and I can't get to a stable platform. A pause that lasted long enough to carry weight. She had the tourniquet positioned with her left-hand windlass half secured. She looked at the rear cargo area, the second case on the left. 9 years. Her mother's voice at a grave in Montana on a morning in April that had been offensively warm and clear. He died for those things. Promise me. She looked at Sutton. He was 22 years old. She had seen the photograph in his wallet, his family at a lake, his mother laughing at something outside the frame. She thought about her father's voice. Not the one at the graveside, the one from the flat field behind the barn on spring mornings, patient and exact. Between heartbeats. That's where everything happens. She finished securing the tourniquet with her left hand, confirmed the windlass locked. Then she reached back and opened the Barrett case. She was aware of Wexler going very still at the edge of her peripheral vision, the particular stillness of someone watching something they had suspected but not been certain of until this moment. She got the rifle to the window. Her position was imperfect, the back seat of a stopped vehicle. Not a stable platform, not any of the setups she had been trained on, but available was what you worked with, and working with what was available was itself a skill. She found the roof through the scope. The shooter was positioned at the north edge, using a raised ventilation housing for cover visible in partial profile. She ranged him mentally against what she knew. 740 meters, northwest wind 9 miles per hour, temperature 41. Bullet drop approximately 260 inches. Wind drift approximately 12 inches of compensation required windward. She settled the reticle, breathed in 4 counts, held 7 counts, and then the 9 years arrived all at once, not as hesitation as presence. As the full accumulated weight of every day she had kept that promise pressing on the trigger finger she had not used in 9 years. Her hands, for the first time she could remember, were not completely steady. The shot broke imperfectly. She watched through the scope as the round struck the ventilation housing 6 inches left of her intended point of impact. The shooter dropped below the roofline and was gone. 8 seconds. He came back up, repositioned, recalculating. She worked the bolt. She breathed. She thought of nothing. Not the promise, not her mother, not 9 years. She thought of the field behind the barn and the wind crossing it without obstacle, and her father's voice saying the one thing it always came back to, the thing that was not about guns or distance or atmospheric conditions, but about the person behind all of those things. Find the stillness. Between the heartbeats. That's where you live. She found it. The shot broke clean, 740 meters. The shooter went down and did not come back up. She lowered the rifle. From outside the vehicle, Wexler said in a voice entirely level and entirely without surprise, "Target down." Inside, Sutton turned his head toward her, still conscious. He looked at her with the expression of someone who had just watched something that did not fit into any category he had previously established. She said, "You're going to be fine, don't move the leg." She was already checking the tourniquet. Her hands were steady again. The 8 seconds between the first shot and the second were something she would think about later in private, in the way she thought about everything that required more space than the immediate situation allowed. Later, not now. Greer appeared at the window. He looked at her, at the Barrett, at Sutton's leg. He said, "How bad? Ephemeral. I have it controlled. He needs a surgical facility within the hour." Greer was already on the radio reorganizing the situation with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to keep moving when plans changed, because the alternative to movement was worse. Stannard appeared behind Greer. He looked through the window at the rifle and at Sutton's leg and at the roofline where the shooter had been, and his face moved through a sequence of expressions she did not try to catalog. He said, "Where did you learn that?" She said, "My father taught me." He said it again, quieter. "Your father." She had already returned her attention to Sutton. The clinical picture was her job, and the job was what mattered, and there would be time for everything else later if they all kept doing their jobs correctly. Behind her, she heard Stannard say to no one in particular, "Who is this woman?" She heard Wexler answer, but not what he said. She kept her eyes on Sutton and her hands on her work, and let the question exist behind her where it would wait, as questions always waited for a moment when there was room for it. That moment came 3 hours later in a secure annex of the Thermont facility, in a room with 2 chairs and a thermos of coffee that someone had left on the table. Harwick came alone. He closed the door and sat across from her and looked at her for a moment without speaking. He said, "Tell me about your father." She looked at the coffee. He grew up in Whitefish, enlisted at 18, Marine Recon, 4 deployments. A pause. He started teaching me to shoot when I was 8. He believed in understanding the full range of what was available. She said he was killed in action in Kunar Province, Afghanistan, in April 2010. I was 13. Harik was quiet. He taught me for 5 years, she said. The skills aren't in my service record because I've never used them in service. I enlisted 4 years after he died. I promised my mother I would choose medicine. She looked at her hands. I kept that promise for 9 years. Harik said, until this afternoon. She said, until this afternoon. The room was quiet, then Harik said, I knew your father. She looked up. Once. Kunar Province, 2003. I was running an operation that needed Marine recon support, and Owen Calloway was the senior NCO they sent. We worked together for 11 days. He said it without sentiment, as a fact. In 11 days, I concluded he was one of the most capable and trustworthy men I had encountered in a career full of capable and trustworthy men. She said he was. Harik said, I never found a satisfactory explanation for what happened to him in 2010. The after-action reporting was complete. The official account was coherent. But certain elements never resolved cleanly, and over the years, those elements have accumulated into something I have not been able to set aside. She looked at him. I'm telling you this because what happens tonight may be relevant to both of us in ways I can't fully anticipate. He placed a folder on the table between them. Novak regained partial consciousness an hour ago. He confirmed the complete server backup is in the Frederick facility. Merritt's team is already there. We have approximately 3 hours. She opened the folder and studied the facility layout. Harik said, there's one accessible approach on the south side. The others are covered by an adjacent structure that provides elevation with clear sight lines on any team moving in from any other direction. She said distance. He said 1,100 meters approximately. 1,100 meters was a different proposition than 740. The bullet drop at that distance exceeded 400 inches depending on barrel specifics and muzzle velocity. Wind drift at the conditions they could reasonably expect cold night air, variable wind required calculation and patience rather than estimation. Not an impossible shot, a shot that required deliberation rather than reaction. The kind of shot her father had spent 5 years preparing her for. She said, I'll need current atmospheric data and time to set up properly. Harik said, you'll have both. He stood and at the door he paused. Your father trusted you with this before you were old enough to understand it. He said, I think he knew exactly what he was doing. He left. She sat alone with the folder and the thermos of coffee in the cold Maryland night, pressing against the walls and her father's voice somewhere in the back of everything patient as Montana spring saying what it had always said. She opened the folder and studied the facility layout until she understood it by shape and logic and the way that space determined the options available within it. Then she drank the coffee, slowly because the hours ahead would require everything she had, and she intended to arrive at them prepared. They left for Frederick at 2200 hours. 2 vehicles, different route. Greer drove the lead with Harwick and 2 members of the Admiral's protective detail. Tessa rode in the second vehicle with Wexler and Stanner the Barrett case in the cargo area, her medical kit between her feet. The night was cold and clear. The kind of clear that arrived after a front stripped the air of everything forgiving, leaving only the hard geometry of stars and bare trees and road lines receding into the dark. She watched the Maryland countryside pass and ran through the facility layout the way she ran through a patient's chart before a complex procedure, not memorizing but understanding the logic that connected each element to every other, so that when conditions changed, as conditions always changed, she would have something more durable than a plan. Wexler drove without conversation. Stannard sat in the passenger seat and said nothing, which was its own form of communication from a man who had said too many things that morning. 20 minutes out, Harwick's voice on the radio, Merritt had requested emergency authorization for an unscheduled site inspection at the Frederick facility. The request had been granted. His inspection team was already on site. They had approximately 40 minutes before the server was gone. She absorbed this without changing her breathing. They parked 3 blocks from the facility in the shadow of a vacant commercial property. Greer coordinated approach positions with the efficiency of someone who had done this in places with considerably less margin. Tessa listened to her assignment and understood it. Immediately elevated position, northwest structure, covering the south approach, while Greer's element moved to secure the entrance and extract the server. She took the Barrett and her medical kit and followed Wexler to the adjacent 2-story storage building. Roof access through a fire door on the eastern side. The roof was flat and tarred and cold, and it gave her exactly the sight line she had been told it would give. She settled into prone position near the northwest parapet and began building her firing solution properly without the compromises the vehicle and stopped road had forced on her that afternoon. She ranged the south access road, 1,120 meters to the facility entrance. Wind northwest at 11 miles per hour, gusting to 14 and 4 to 6 second cycles. Temperature 37 degrees. She tracked 3 gust cycles before settling on her approach, finding the predictable window of stillness between gusts. She set the scope adjustments. Wexler called wind readings at 30-second intervals in the flat-specific language of a trained spotter terminology and cadence that matched the rhythm of the task rather than the rhythm of conversation. She used what he gave her. Below Greer's element was moving. Greer's voice on the radio, 2 men at the entrance, one visible through the south window. Then a pause. Fourth man, moving along the north side of the building. The fourth was the problem. He would reach the east corner in 90 seconds and have a direct sight line to the entry team during the breach. No ground element was positioned to intercept him. Wexler said, 11 o'clock, 830 meters, moving target. She found him in the scope. Dark jacket staying close to the building wall, train movement. A moving target at 830 meters in gusting wind at night required anticipation rather than calculation. She tracked his movement vector, estimated his pace adjusted for the oblique angle. Wexler said, wind dropping, 4 seconds. She led him by 6 inches, felt the lull beginning. The shot broke in the stillness between gusts, 830 meters. The man went down against the facility wall and did not rise. Wexler exhaled once, then quietly, almost to himself, your father taught you well. She worked the bolt and reacquired the south approach. Greer's breach began 30 seconds later. She held her position on the roof, tracking movement through the facility's south-facing windows, listening to the radio as Greer's team worked through the building with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this enough times for the procedure to be automatic. 4 minutes into the breach, she heard Stannard confirm the server room. Then Greer, Merritt is on site. He came himself, north corridor, followed by a sound she had not planned for. A sharp crack from inside the facility's structural material under sudden force, and then Sutton's voice on the radio, compressed and immediate. Doc, north stairwell, I need Doc now. She was off the parapet before the transmission finished. Down the fire stairs with the barrack case slung and her medical kit in hand, across the 3 blocks at the pace of someone moving toward a problem, rather than away from one. Wexler, matching her stride for stride. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say that the situation had not already communicated. The north stairwell was reached through a service entrance. Inside, Sutton on the floor of the landing, between the first and second floors, seated against the wall, his face the color of someone whose respiratory system was working against him. Stannard was beside him, both hands pressed to the upper right chest, applying pressure, with the competence of a man who knew something was wrong and was doing the only thing available to him without knowing exactly what he was holding together. She saw it immediately. The mechanism was the stairs. He had come down fast in the dark and caught the railing at an angle that had done what his femoral injury that afternoon had almost done, chosen the worst possible target. Right chest. The paradoxical breathing she could see from the doorway, the chest wall moving in the wrong direction at the wrong time. The distended neck vein visible above his collar. Tension pneumothorax. The pleural space filling with trapped air. The lung collapsing, the heart beginning to deviate from its correct position as pressure built on the wrong side of his chest. Without intervention in the next few minutes, the cascade would become irreversible. She was already moving toward him, already opening her kit as she moved, already locating the needle by feel. Because in a situation like this, the 2 seconds spent looking for a tool were the 2 seconds that determined the outcome. She told Stannard to move his hands. He moved them. She located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular, line right side, the same anatomical landmark she had found hundreds of times. Always the same, the body's geography consistent, regardless of what else was inconsistent about the situation. She looked at Sutton. Breathe out as much as you can. He exhaled. She inserted the needle. The hiss of escaping air was immediate and unmistakable. The compressed pleural space decompressed, pressing through the 14-gauge needle, the pressure releasing, the mediastinal shift reversing. Sutton's next breath came differently. Not fully recovered, not resolved, but different in the specific way that meant the cascade had been interrupted. She held the needle in place with her left hand, maintaining the decompression. Her right hand was free, from the stairwell above footsteps. Two sets, moving fast, not with the cadence of Greer's team. These were people descending in response to the sounds of the breach coming down the only exit available to them. Stannard was positioned against the wrong wall. Wexler was 3 meters back, moving to reposition. The stairwell opened directly onto the landing. The first man came around the bend at approximately 8 meters. Tessa's right hand drew the M17 from her hip holster. Her left hand did not move. The needle did not move. The pressure she was managing through her left hand admitted no interruption, no fraction of displaced attention, no concession to anything other than the work it was doing. She shot the first man once controlled at 8 meters. He went down. The second man was 4 steps behind him. He registered what had happened and checked his momentum, the half-second of hesitation that cost him the initiative. She shot him before he recovered it. Her right hand returned the M17 to its holster. Her left hand had not moved from the needle throughout. She returned her full attention to Sutton. Both hands, now her right joining the left, to position the occlusive dressing that needed to seal the decompression, sight, her fingers working with the deliberate efficiency of someone performing a procedure that had been practiced into the deepest available layer of muscle memory. Sutton's breathing continued to stabilize under her hands. Both hands. She became aware gradually and then completely of the silence in the stairwell. She looked up. Greer was standing at the top of the landing. She did not know when he had arrived. He was simply there the way men with his particular training sometimes simply appeared at the edges of situations, and he was looking at her hands on Sutton's chest, at the two men on the stairs, at the needle, at the dressing, at the whole of what had happened in this space in the last 90 seconds, with the expression of a man who was comprehending something that exceeded every category he had built for it. He did not speak. He walked down the 3 steps to the landing, moving without hurry, with the measured weight of someone approaching a moment that required the right kind of deliberateness. He reached into the chest pocket of his jacket and took out a coin. Not a challenge coin presented ceremonially, a coin worn smooth at the edges from being carried for years, its face still legible from use rather than preservation. The Ranger tab on one side, the regimental crest on the other, the kind of thing a man carried not for display, but because it had come to represent something that mattered beyond its material existence. Greer looked at Tessa for one long moment. Then he placed the coin on the floor beside her medical kit. He looked at her once more, not the measuring attention of a man determining whether a resource met his requirements, but something older and simpler than that. Something that did not need a word attached to it to be completely legible. He went back up the stairs without speaking. Wexler crossed the landing, picked up the coin, and placed it in Tessa's free hand. She held it for a moment. Then she placed it in the pocket of her jacket alongside the Riverstone that was in the cardboard box in her truck, which she would retrieve tomorrow, and which she kept because her father had given it to her and because certain things persisted past their physical location. She returned her attention to Sutton, both hands on her patient, the way it was supposed to be. Merritt was in the facility's administrative section when Greer's team reached him, standing over the server terminal, with the expression of a man who had arrived too late to change the outcome and was processing the implications of that fact. He was placed in restraints without incident, and he was brought through the corridor to the room where Harwick and Tessa were waiting, and he looked at Tessa when he entered the room with the specific look of a man who was updating his understanding of which piece had undone him. He said, "You should have stayed out of the inventory records." She said, "You should have used the right tourniquets." He looked at her without changing his expression. She said, "Kunar Province, 2010. Something shifted behind his face. She said the 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion requested emergency resupply of combat casualty care equipment in March 2010. The request was logged. The fulfillment was documented. Meridian Solutions delivered. She looked at him with the complete, unsparing attention she gave to patients in critical states, not with emotion, but with accuracy. The combat application tourniquets in that shipment met visual specifications and failed at a rate of 38% under operational pressure. A Marine Corpsman documented this in a field assessment filed through the regimental surgeon. The assessment reached the contracting office. It was marked, reviewed, and filed. Merritt said nothing. The Marine recon element that suffered the highest casualty rate in that deployment was the one that used those kits during the April engagement. She said, "My father bled to death in the field because a tourniquet failed. The corpsman who tried to save him submitted a supplemental report. That report was also marked, reviewed, and filed." The room was completely quiet. Harwick stood near the wall with his hands clasped behind his back, his face carrying the contained, stone-heavy gravity of a man who had suspected something for a long time and was now hearing it confirmed with a precision that removed every remaining ambiguity. Merritt looked at the floor. He said, "I didn't know who he was." She said, "That's the worst part." He looked up. She said, "You didn't know, and it didn't matter to you. He was a line in a field assessment, and you filed it. He was a liability, and you managed it. He was a problem, and you made him disappear." Her voice had not changed pitch or volume. "He had a daughter who was 13 years old, and you didn't know her name, and you didn't consider it. And that is exactly how something like this functions. Nobody is the specific target. Everybody is simply in the way." Merritt said, "This was larger than any single decision." She said, "On it, every part of this was one decision at a time. That is always how it's built, and that is always how it comes apart." She left the room. In the corridor outside, she stood against the wall with her eyes closed for 30 seconds. Not long, enough to let the clinical distance she had maintained in that room complete its function and allow the thing beneath it to be acknowledged in private before she put it back in the place where she kept the things that would be returned to when there was space for them. She opened her eyes. Wexler was at the far end of the corridor, his back to her, standing with the deliberate consideration of someone who understood that certain moments required space rather than company. She said, "Sutton." He said without turning, "Out of surgery, stable, asking for you apparently with some persistence." She said, "He's 22 years old." Wexler said, "He is." She allowed herself a moment of complete and uncomplicated relief for that fact. Then she walked down the corridor toward Harwick. The Admiral was in the facility's main office, standing over the table where the server had been placed alongside a laptop his technical personnel were already working through. He looked up when she entered. He said, "Intact, full transaction records going back 6 years. Supplier documentation, chain of custody for every shipment Meridian Solutions processed through military medical contracts on the Eastern Seaboard." He paused. "And the field assessment reports, every one that was filed and buried. They were not destroyed, they were retained, kept as leverage." She understood without requiring it to be elaborated. "Including the Kunar Province supplemental from 2010, including the Corpsman's report." She stood still. Harwick reached into the interior pocket of his uniform jacket and removed an envelope. She recognized it before she had fully processed why she recognized it, not from having seen it, but through some channel that operated below conscious identification. The handwriting on the front was blue ballpoint block letters pressed firmly into the paper. Her father had always written that way, as though words deserved the effort of permanence. The envelope was addressed to Admiral Gerald Harwick, Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. Below the address, in a slightly different hand, the same person but writing in a moment rather than drafting a single added line. "For Tessa, when she's ready." Harwick said, "January 2009, before the deployment." He included a cover letter documenting everything he had observed in the contracting operations over 18 months. He named Merritt specifically. He said he wanted a record outside the chain of command in case something happened to him. A pause. He also said his daughter was not to receive the contents until she was ready. He did not define ready. He looked at her directly. "I have spent 14 years determining whether any given moment qualified." She said, "What decided it?" Harwick said, "A woman who held a decompression needle in place with one hand and protected her patient with the other at the same time on a stairwell landing in Frederick, Maryland, without choosing between them, without hesitating." He looked at her with the steadiness of a man who had reached an end of a very long road. "That is what your father meant, I think. I understand it now." She took the envelope. She said, "Can I have a moment?" He said, "Take what you need. Take what you..." He left. She sat at the table and held the envelope. She felt the weight of it, the fact that it had been in a safe or a drawer for 14 years, moving through time without her, while she moved through time without knowing it existed. She opened it carefully, working the dried tape loose at the corner, preserving the envelope itself. 2 pages inside, both sides. His handwriting dated January 14, 2009. He wrote about what he had observed in the contracting operations, the discrepancies, the specific individual responsible, the reports he had submitted, and the silence that answered them. He wrote precisely without emotion, in the language of a man creating a record that might be needed rather than a complaint seeking sympathy. The second page was addressed to her. He wrote that he had not told her everything because there were things a child should not carry before she had the strength for them. He wrote that he had taught her what he taught her, not because he wanted her to become what he was, but because he believed that capable people should understand the full reach of their capabilities, and because the world was complicated, and because there would be moments in her life when knowing how to be precise and patient and still would matter in ways he could not predict. He wrote, "I don't know who you've become. I know who you were becoming. I was proud of every part of it. Whatever you've done with the years between this letter and the moment you were reading it, I trust it completely and without reservation." He wrote, "The most important thing I ever learned was that the hands that heal and the hands that protect are not two different sets of hands. They are the same hands doing what the moment requires. I hope you've understood that. I think you have. I think you always will." The last line, "Tell your mother I kept my promise to her as long as I could." She'll know what that means. She sat with the pages for a long time. The facility was quiet around her. Through the wall, she could hear the low voices of Harwick's team processing the server, the ordinary sounds of a situation being properly concluded. The wind moved against the building's exterior with the same patience it had shown all night. She folded the pages along their original creases and placed them back in the envelope and held it in both hands. One hand that had placed a needle into a collapsing lung in the dark on a stairwell floor. One hand that had made 2 shots, the second one clean, the stillness found in the dark at distances that most people would not have attempted in daylight, on a range with optimal conditions. Both hands, the same hands. She placed the envelope in the inner pocket of her jacket close to her chest where she could feel its edges when she breathed. Then she stood up and went back to work. The federal vehicles arrived from Bethesda at 0130 hours, with the quiet institutional formality of an organization that had been waiting for a call that had finally come. Tessa watched from the parking area as Merritt was escorted out and the vehicles moved away down the Frederick Road, and she felt not the catharsis that stories assign to such moments, but something closer to the feeling she had after a complex procedure concluded correctly, the quiet recognition of a system returning to the state it was supposed to occupy. The relief of a long deviation corrected. It was enough. Harwick found her there and stood beside her as the taillights disappeared around the far corner. He said, "The IG's office receives the full package this morning. Senate Armed Services Committee has been notified. The FBI is managing the criminal referral." A pause. "Merritt will have legal representation and due process because that is how the system functions, and the system functioning correctly matters most in the cases that make it hardest to remember why." He said this without apology. "What I can tell you is that the procurement network ends here. Every contracting relationship will be audited. Every field report that was filed and buried will be formally entered into the permanent record." She said, "Including the names." He said, "Including every name." He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a folded document. "Your termination order was voided at 1800 hours. You're on administrative leave pending formal reinstatement, which will be completed within the week." He placed the document in her hand. "After that, your assignment options are open. I have thoughts, but that conversation can wait until you've slept." She said, "Sutton." Harwick said, "Full recovery according to the surgical team. He's been asking for you with considerable persistence." She nodded and looked at the sky, clear cold, the stars in their permanent, indifferent arrangement above the Maryland hills. Harwick said, "Good night, Staff Sergeant." She said, "Good night, sir." Inside, near the door, Stannard was waiting, not standing in his usual posture with arms crossed, an expression communicating preformed conclusions. Standing with his hands at his sides, which was a different thing entirely. He looked at her. He said, "I need to say something." She waited. He said, "This morning I made remarks based on things I hadn't earned the right to an opinion about. That was wrong when I said it, and it was wrong the moment before I opened my mouth." He met her eyes with the directness of someone who was not going to look away from a thing just because it was uncomfortable to face. "What I saw tonight, I don't have adequate language for it. I'm not sure the language exists." A pause. "I'm sorry, Doc." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Okay." He nodded. She walked past him to the vehicle. Behind her, she heard Wexler say to Stannard, "She held that needle through 2 shots at close range. Never moved the hand." Stannard said, "I know, I was there." Wexler said, "Both hands." Stannard was quiet for several seconds. Then, "Hell of a father." She got into the vehicle and closed the door and looked out the window at the Frederick night. And she thought about her father not with the weight of grief that weight had become over 14 years, something she had learned to carry rather than something that carried her, but with the specific gratitude of someone who had been given exactly the right tools by someone who understood that you could not always know in advance which tools would be needed. And so the correct approach was to give the ones that would be useful across the widest possible range of what the world might ask. He had given her both. She had used both. 6 months later, Fort Sam Houston, Texas, on a Tuesday morning in early May. The Texas air outside was already warm. The classroom was cool, and carried the particular institutional smell of military educational facilities, dry erase markers, and industrial carpet, and the faint ghost of decades of chalk. 18 students arranged in the seats. On the whiteboard at the front, 4 words in block letters written by hand. Steady hands save lives. Below that, added this semester at the suggestion of a retired chief petty officer, consulting on the curriculum, both kinds. Tessa stood at the front of the room and let the silence sit for a moment before she spoke. She had learned from her father that silence was not an absence. It was attention taking its correct form before something worth attending to was said. She said, "You were sent here because someone in your chain of command concluded that the line between medical care and force protection is less clear in the field than it is on an organizational chart. They are correct." She said, "This course will make you competent in both functions and capable of transitioning between them within the time the situation provides. That time is sometimes measured in minutes, sometimes in seconds. The course does not ask you to prefer one function over the other. It asks you to be ready to perform whichever one the moment requires, and then ready to perform the other one immediately after." A hand in the second row, a young Army medic with the alert skepticism of someone who had formed opinions about training programs and was not yet ready to revise them. She said, "Is the simultaneous element realistic, actually doing both at the same time?" Tessa said, "It is the only element that matters." The student wrote something in her notebook. Tessa watched her write it and recognized the movement, a person recording something they intended to return to, not because they were certain it was true yet, but because they were willing to be convinced. That was enough. That was where all of it started. The circles under Tessa's eyes had faded over the winter. She had gained back the weight she had lost in the months following November, when sleep had been irregular and appetite had followed sleep's example. She ran 6 miles every morning at a pace she chose for pleasure rather than preparation, because she had decided that some things were worth doing for their own sake rather than for what they were building toward. She slept 7 hours most nights. The trajectory was the right one. On a Thursday evening in March, she had called her mother. Her mother answered on the second ring. They talked for 40 minutes. Near the end, Tessa said, "I want to tell you about something that happened in November." She told her not every detail, but the shape of it. The hospital, the evidence, the road and the shot she had missed and the shot she had not missed, the stairwell, the letter. Her mother was quiet for a long time when she finished. Then she said, "He told me once that you were going to understand things he hadn't figured out yet." He said it with absolute certainty, the way he said the things he already knew. Tessa said, "I remember." Her mother said, "The last thing he told me before that deployment was that you were going to be all right. Not that he hoped so, not that he thought so. He said it as a fact the way he stated facts." Another pause. "I held on to that for 14 years. Tessa said, "You can let it go now." She heard her mother exhale fully, slowly, the breath of someone setting down something they had been carrying for so long they had stopped noticing the weight until the moment it was gone. Her mother said, "He would have been so proud of you." Tessa said, "I know." After the call, she sat at the small desk in her quarters and looked at the items arranged on it. The challenge coin Greer had placed on a stairwell floor in Frederick, now kept beside her father's river, stone, both retrieved from the cardboard box and returned to their proper positions as objects that had weight beyond their material existence. The envelope from January 2009 in the drawer, its presence felt even when she was not looking at it the way the presence of certain things was felt. She opened her laptop. In her inbox, between the administrative correspondence of a course in its second month, was a message from an address she recognized from the weeks following November. Admiral Harwick. Subject line, "When you're ready," 3 sentences. The first described the situation. The second described what was needed. The third said, "Your call, 800. She read it twice. She thought about the 18 students who would be in that classroom in 11 hours. She thought about the second cohort starting in August, about Sutton's photograph from 2 weeks ago himself, at a combat medicine refresher at Fort Liberty, standing at a range with a cat tourniquet in one hand, and the grin of someone who understood something now that they had not understood before. She thought about Greer scheduled to arrive in 3 weeks to join the training cadre. About Wexler consulting on curriculum from his home on the Virginia coast, calling in on Thursday afternoons, with the precise and hurried input of someone who had done the work and wanted the next generation to do it better. She thought about both hands. She typed, "I'll be there." She closed the laptop and went to sleep. In the morning, she was up before the base, committed to the day, running the post roads in the pre-dawn dark with the easy rhythm of someone moving through the world rather than against it. The Texas sky went from black to deep blue above the buildings and the tree line and the flat geometry of a post that knew precisely what it was and did not pretend to be anything else. She ran without music, without a pack, without anything except the rhythm of her own breathing and the sound of her feet on the road and the sky performing its slow, daily transformation above her. She thought about the transition drill the students would run for the first time that afternoon, the exercise that most of them would find harder than they expected, not because the physical skills were beyond them, but because of the mental architecture required to hold two things simultaneously without one displacing the other. The understanding that the hands that healed and the hands that protected were the same hands responding to what the moment required. She had been building that architecture her whole life. Her father had started laying the foundation before she understood what he was doing. He had known with the certainty he brought to the things he already understood that she would one day need every part of what he had given her. Not the shooting, not the medicine, not either one in isolation, but the integration of both. The willingness to use each without apology when the situation required it. The wisdom to know which the situation required and the capacity to know that sometimes the situation required both. She finished her run at the steps of the classroom building and stood for a moment in the early morning air, breathing evenly, watching the sky complete its transition from deep blue to the pale gray of a May morning, still deciding whether to be more than adequate. Then she straightened up. Her hands were at her sides, steady, still. The same hands that had been steady on every morning she could remember, and on every morning she could not steady through 14 months at Fort Detrick and one November Tuesday, and a roof in Frederick, and a stairwell landing in the dark in a flat field in Montana, and a grieving afternoon in April 2010, that she had survived and carried and eventually carefully made into something she could use. Both hands. She went inside. There was work to do. She knew how to do it. She intended to do it well. There are people who carry two things that the world insists on treating as opposites: the capacity to heal and the capacity to protect. The steadiness required to save a life and the steadiness required to end the threat to that life. The world insists these are different people, different skills, different callings, sorted into separate categories by training and tradition and the institutional convenience of specialization. Owen Calloway had not believed that. He had spent 5 years teaching his daughter not to believe it either. He had done it because he understood, with the quiet certainty of a man who had been in enough situations to know what situations actually required, that the hands which mattered most in the moments that mattered most were the ones that could do both. Not alternating, not apologetically, but simultaneously, completely, with the same steadiness applied to each. He had written as much in a letter he sealed in an envelope and trusted to the one man he believed would understand when to deliver it. He had not lived to see whether he was right, but he had known, in the way he had always known, the things worth knowing, with the patient certainty of a man who had found the stillness between the heartbeats and learned to live there. He had known. Tessa Calloway went into the classroom. 18 students looked up as she entered. She walked to the front of the room, set her notes on the desk, and looked at them for a moment, at their different faces, their different backgrounds, the different levels of certainty and uncertainty they carried into the room with them. She thought about a flat field in Montana, about the wind crossing it without obstacle, about a patient voice saying the same thing until it was not a lesson anymore, but a fact as much a part of her as breathing. She picked up the marker and added 3 words below what was already written on the board. Steady hands save lives, both kinds, both at once. She turned back to the room. She began.